So if you go out today and just, ask the average person on the street when the fight for LGBTQ rights actually started.
Right, you'll probably get the exact same answer from almost everyone.
Exactly. Most people will point straight to, like, a hot, humid summer night in New York City, June of 1969, the Stonewall Uprising.
Yeah, that's the narrative we're usually handed.
Right. We're taught to view that specific night at that specific bar in Greenwich Village as I guess, the absolute big bang of the movement. Like, it was this singular moment where resistance was just born out of thin air.
Which is, oh, that's a very streamlined way to look at it.
It is. But what if I told you that the true physical spark of this resistance, one of the earliest major clashes, actually involves a transgender woman throwing a cup of scalding hot coffee directly into a police officer's face?
And that happened in a 24-hour diner in San Francisco.
Yes. A whole 3 years before Stonewall even happened.
So today we are basically tearing up that simplified timer.
You really are. We're taking you on a comprehensive deep dive into the global evolution of LGBTQ rights. We want to explore a much deeper, frankly, a far more complex history than the headlines usually offer you.
And to map out this history accurately, we're drawing upon a really detailed collection of archival material. We're not just guessing here.
No, we've got the actual documents.
Right. We're looking at historical site records from the National Park Service, curated cultural artifacts from the Smithsonian Institution, and decades of complex legal documentation.
Stuff from Lambda Legal and the ACLU, right?
Exactly. Along with extensive primary source documents preserved by the Library of Congress. Our objective today is to move entirely beyond, just a basic chronological list of dates and acronyms.
Because our mission with this deep dive is to understand the actual mechanics of this history. We really want to examine the how and the why.
Mechanisms of change.
Yeah. Like, how do these covert, highly secretive, completely underground networks eventually transform into a globally recognized human rights campaign?
And how did multiple intersecting identities within this community?
Identities that, let's be honest, frequently clashed with one another.
Oh, absolutely. How did they ultimately drive the broader movement forward despite those clashes?
It's a scholarly journey, for sure, but I think it's one that is deeply rooted in the lived, often perilous experiences of real people.
It is. We're going to be analyzing why certain organizational tactics were chosen in very specific decades.
Like, why did they do things a certain way in the 50s versus the 70s?
Exactly. How did a marginalized community respond to profound, state-sponsored systemic oppression? And how were the legal and social frameworks we recognize today painstakingly constructed, dismantled, and then just rebuilt over generations?
So to really get into this, before we can even begin to talk about flying coffee cups in the late 1960s, you really have to put yourself in the mindset of the era that made that kind of explosive resistance absolutely necessary.
You have to understand the pressure cooker they were in.
Right. We have to go back to the paranoia of the Cold War era. We really need to talk about the Lavender Scare.
The Lavender Scare is, well, it's the mandatory starting point for understanding modern queer history.
And for a listener who might only be familiar with the Red Scare, the hunt for communists, how did the federal government suddenly turn its vast investigative machinery toward the LGBTQ community?
Well, in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, the United States was just completely consumed by Cold War anxieties.
Everyone was terrified of spies.
Exactly. So, parallel to Senator Joseph McCarthy's really aggressive hearings hunting for communist sympathizers, the federal government initiated a systematic, heavily bureaucratic purge of suspected homosexual employees.
It was an official policy.
Yes. The major turning point arrived in 1953 when President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450.
Which did what exactly?
It essentially codified the idea that gay and lesbian people were inherent security risks. It officially classified them alongside alcoholics and individuals with severe psychiatric disorders.
Wait, hold on. I'm trying to square the logic here. What was the actual mechanism of that threat in the government's eyes?
It's a bit convoluted by today's standards.
Like, how does someone working a desk job at the State Department who just happens to be gay pose a literal threat to national security?
The mechanism was rooted in this profound circular logic. The government's rationale was that because society, and honestly the government itself, forced homosexuals to keep their lives a strict secret.
Under threat of total ruin, right?
Right. Because of that forced secrecy, they were considered uniquely vulnerable to blackmail by foreign agents, particularly Soviet operatives.
Okay, so the theory was a Soviet spy discovers a State Department employee is secretly gay.
threatens to expose them to their boss and their family.
And the employee hands over classified documents just to protect their reputation.
That was the exact theory.
So the state forces a group of people into extreme hiding, criminalizes their very existence, and then punishes them and fires them specifically for being hidden.
That is the precise paradox. And the execution of this purge, I mean, it was brutal.
They weren't just casually firing people.
No. Federal agencies set up specialized investigative units. I mean, imagine you are a mid-level civil servant in, say, 1954. You're suddenly pulled into a windowless room and interrogated for hours by federal agents.
Just absolutely terrified.
They demand to know who your friends are, what bars you frequent, and whether you have ever engaged in, and this was their wording, perverted acts.
Didn't they also do surveillance?
Oh, yes. They would track license plates outside of suspected gay bars and then cross-reference those plates with federal employee registries.
Wow.
Thousands of federal workers lost their jobs, their pensions, their entire livelihoods. And their reputations were ruined. Many actually took their own lives rather than face the public exposure.
It's just devastating. But, history shows us that intense targeted oppression often forces a community to organize simply to survive.
Absolutely. Survival necessitates organization.
And the records from the National Park Service highlight that even in this intensely hostile, dangerous climate, early LGBTQ organizations actually began to form. They called themselves the homophile movement.
Yes. And the term homophile was chosen very deliberately.
Why that specific word?
It emphasizes love and affinity rather than sexuality. It was a highly strategic linguistic choice to appear less threatening to the conservative mainstream.
Oh, I see. Deflecting from the physical acts that the government was so obsessed with.
Exactly. And the roots of this organizing go back surprisingly far. The archives actually point to 1924 in Chicago.
1924, that's way earlier than most people think.
It is. A German immigrant named Henry Gerber founded the Society for Human Rights, which is widely considered the first recognized gay rights organization in the United States.
What did they actually do back then?
They produced a newsletter, but the police rapidly shut the organization down. They arrested Gerber, confiscated all his materials, and that was the end of that chapter.
Yeah, the climate in the 1920s was just too harsh for anything to really take root. But by the 1950s, right in the middle of the Lavender Scare, the organizing starts to stick a little bit more.
It does. You start seeing slightly more resilient groups.
Like the Mattachine Society, right? Founded in 1950 in Los Angeles by Harry Hay.
Yes, and later propelled into national prominence by figures like Frank Kameny.
Kameny is such a fascinating figure. He actually worked as an astronomer for the Army Map Service.
And he was a Harvard-trained PhD.
Right. And he lost his government job during the Lavender Scare. But instead of retreating into the shadows like so many others were forced to do, he decided to literally sue the federal government.
Which was basically unheard of at the time. And it wasn't just men organizing. For lesbians, you had the Daughters of Bilitis.
Founded in San Francisco in 1955, right? By Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon.
Exactly. It initially started as a safe social alternative to the frequently raided lesbian bars, but it grew into a vital political network.
So these groups were laying the vital, completely unseen groundwork for a civil rights struggle. They were establishing communication networks, publishing newsletters, and utilizing early legal strategies just to secure basic survival.
And a truly landmark moment in this era occurred in 1958 with a Supreme Court case called One, Inc. v. Olson.
Oh, this case is so important. One magazine was a prominent early gay publication affiliated with the Mattachine Network, right?
Yes, but the U.S. Postal Service, acting under the broad authority of the Comstock laws, completely refused to deliver the magazine.
And the Comstock laws were these old anti-obscenity laws.
Right. The postmaster classified the magazine as obscene, lewd, lascivious, and filthy.
But I want to clarify the legal mechanism here for the listener. The post office wasn't saying the magazine contained explicit imagery or pornography, were they?
No, not at all.
They were saying that the mere intellectual discussion of gay people existing was legally obscene and therefore totally ineligible for mail delivery.
That is exactly correct. And it was an existential threat to the movement. I mean, think about it. If you cannot use the mail, you cannot distribute a newsletter. And if you can't distribute a newsletter, you cannot organize a national movement in the 1950s.
Right. There's no internet. The mail is everything. So One, Inc. sued.
They did. They lost in the lower courts, which wasn't surprising, but they appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1958, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision.
Didn't they do it without even hearing full arguments?
Yeah, they didn't even hear oral arguments. They simply issued a per curiam decision overturning the lower courts, ruling that non-explicit discussions of homosexuality were actually protected under the First Amendment.
Which is an enormous structural victory. It meant the government couldn't legally silence you just for publishing content about gay people. You finally have a legally protected communication channel.
And that legal victory really emboldened public action. By the mid-1960s, activists were taking their demands out of the newsletters and physically into the real world.
This leads us to 1966, when members of the Mattachine Society staged a highly publicized sip-in at Julius's Bar in New York City.
Yes, the sip-in.
Let's break down the mechanics of the sip-in, because to a modern listener, walking into a bar and asking for a drink sounds completely mundane.
It sounds like an everyday activity.
But you have to put yourself in a 1966 mindset. The New York State Liquor Authority had rules that prohibited bars from serving alcohol to quote-unquote disorderly individual.
Right. And under the operating logic of the time, the mere presence of a homosexual person was considered legally disorderly.
Just standing there made the room disorderly.
Exactly. If a bar was known to serve gay patrons, the state liquor authority would revoke its liquor license, effectively destroying the business overnight.
Which forced gay bars to operate entirely underground.
Usually run by organized crime syndicates who paid off the police to look the other way.
Right. So the Mattachine activists wanted to challenge this legally. They visited several bars, brought a cadre of newspaper reporters and photographers with them, and when they arrived at Julius's, they explicitly announced themselves.
They walked up to the bartender and said, "We are homosexuals, we are orderly, we intend to remain orderly, and we are asking for service."
And the bartender, who was terrified of losing his license, naturally refused to serve them. And the photographers captured the exact moment he covered the glass with his hand.
It was a brilliant, highly calculated tactic. It was directly inspired by the lunch counter sit-ins of the broader civil rights movement in the South.
And that strategic visibility just continued to grow. You also see the annual reminders, which was a series of pickets starting in 1965.
Organized primarily by Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings.
Right. They picketed outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia every 4th of July. The location was chosen very specifically, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They wanted to remind the country, right at the literal birthplace of American liberty, that a whole specific demographic of Americans was actively being denied their basic constitutional rights.
When I look at the progression from Henry Gerber in the 20s to the Mattachine newsletters to the sip-in at Julius's, the analogy that keeps coming to my mind is a subterranean communications network.
I like that analogy.
Like, on the surface, the political climate is absolutely frozen solid. To the casual observer walking down the street, the movement is completely invisible. But beneath the soil, these organizers are laying miles of fiber optic cable.
They're building the infrastructure.
Exactly. They are securing legal precedents, establishing mailing lists, and building a vast, interconnected network just waiting for the right moment to power up.
The underground infrastructure analogy is crucial, particularly when we analyze the specific tactics they deployed to build it.
What do you mean?
Well, look at the annual reminders in Philadelphia. That's the clearest example.
Yeah.
Frank Kameny enforced an exceptionally strict dress code for the picketers.
He did, didn't he? It was very rigid.
Men were required to wear conservative business suits, white shirts, and ties. Women were required to wear dresses and heels. It was a deliberate, highly manufactured strategy of respectability politics.
Which modern observers, looking back with a 21st century lens, sometimes heavily criticize. They view those photographs of men in identical gray suits walking in a polite circle and think it looks too compliant.
Like they were too eager to assimilate into a society that fundamentally hated them.
Exactly.
But it is very easy to levy that criticism from the safety of the present day. We have to rigorously analyze the mechanisms of power at that time to understand why polite, orderly protest was a tactical weapon, not just compliance.
Right. They didn't have the luxury of being loud yet.
Exactly. They were operating in a society where the psychiatric establishment officially pathologized them as deviant and mentally ill. The government classified them as dangerous subversives, and the police treated them as common criminals.
So how did the suits help?
By dressing immaculately and marching in perfect, silent, disciplined order, they were visually short-circuiting the prevailing narrative.
They were causing cognitive dissonance.
Precisely. They were forcing the public and the media to see a stark contradiction. The government claims these people are dangerous, unstable perverts, yet here they are, looking exactly like your accountant or your school teacher.
They were establishing a baseline of human dignity. You have to prove you belong in the public square and that you are capable of participating in civic life before you can start making broader demands.
It was a necessary stepping stone.
Mhm.
They were utilizing the visual language of the middle class to buy themselves enough political breathing room to organize further.
But polite protest, no matter how impeccably dressed you are, inevitably meets a physical limit.
It always does.
You can wear a tailored suit and carry a polite, grammatically perfect sign all day, but if the daily reality for your community and your neighborhood involves constant police harassment, violent bar raids, and targeted physical abuse, eventually a polite picket line is going to feel woefully insufficient.
The pressure is going to find a different, far more volatile release valve.
Exactly. The transition from polite request for assimilation to direct physical resistance is where the timeline accelerates dramatically. And crucially, it happens well before Stonewall.
Let's examine those sparks that predated the flame. The archival sources point us toward San Francisco in August of 1966.
To a place called Compton's Cafeteria in the Tenderloin District.
Yes, this was a 24-hour diner, and it functioned as one of the few places where transgender people, drag queens, sex workers, and marginalized queer youth could safely congregate out of the cold.
Now, the demographic at Compton's was entirely different from the middle-class professionals picketing in Philadelphia. Right?
Oh, completely different. These were individuals whose very gender presentation was criminalized.
Right, the laws against female impersonation.
Exactly. Also known as masquerading laws. It meant that police could arrest someone simply for wearing clothing that did not match the sex assigned to them at birth.
And the management at Compton's frequently called the police to clear out these patrons, viewing them as a nuisance.
The police would arrive, harass the patrons, physically assault them, and haul them into paddy wagons. It was a routine occurrence.
But on one specific sweltering night in August 1966, that dynamic violently fractured.
It did. A police officer approached a transgender woman seated at a table and grabbed her arm to arrest her.
And instead of submitting, she threw her cup of hot coffee directly into his face.
The ensuing chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Decades of pent-up rage just exploded.
Patrons threw sugar shakers, they flipped those heavy diner tables, they shattered the plate glass windows, and physically fought the police out into the street.
It was an outright sustained riot.
And it was not an isolated incident. Just a few months later, in early 1967, you see a similar escalation in Los Angeles at the Black Cat Tavern.
The Black Cat incident is a really chilling example of police tactics from that era. Plainclothes police officers infiltrated the bar on New Year's Eve.
They just blended in with the crowd.
Right. They waited for the clock to strike midnight, and when patrons embraced and kissed to celebrate the new year, the officers produced their badges, drew weapons, and began brutally beating patrons with batons.
Arresting them literally for the crime of kissing at midnight.
Yes. But the community's response was unprecedented for Los Angeles. Over the next several weeks, hundreds of people organized physical protests outside the bar, loudly demanding an end to police brutality.
So these pre-Stonewall uprisings, Compton's and the Black Cat, they are historically vital because they demonstrate a fundamental shift in the community's threshold for state-sanctioned violence.
Absolutely. The most marginalized elements of the LGBTQ community, particularly transgender women, gender nonconforming people, and working-class queer people, were drawing a physical line in the sand.
They were forcefully asserting that they would no longer quietly accept abuse.
Which brings us to the end of June 1969, the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, New York City.
The setup there is remarkably familiar based on what we've just discussed.
It's the exact same pattern. It's another mafia-run gay bar, another routine police raid late at night, another attempt to line up patrons, force them into bathrooms to check their sex under their clothes, and load them into police wagons.
But the patrons refuse to cooperate. A crowd gathers on the street outside. And as the police use increasing force against a lesbian woman who is handcuffed, the crowd reaches a breaking point and fights back.
For 6 days, the streets of the village become a chaotic battleground of protests, fires, and clashes with the tactical police force.
But I have to stop here and pose a genuine question. I think a lot of people wonder this. If Compton's Cafeteria happened 3 years earlier, and the Black Cat protests happened 2 years earlier, and both were just as militant, why did Stonewall become the universal, globally recognized symbol of the movement?
That's a great question.
Like, why didn't the global liberation movement launch from a diner in San Francisco?
It is a question that historians rigorously debate. And the answer really lies in understanding the synergy between an event and the infrastructure surrounding it.
Okay, so what was different about New York?
First, you have the geographic and cultural context. Stonewall happened in New York City, which was the media capital of the world. Furthermore, it occurred in the summer of 1969, an era absolutely saturated with intense, broader social unrest.
Right, you had the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Black Power movement, the women's liberation movement.
Exactly. The cultural vocabulary for radical protest was already well established in the public consciousness.
But the media ecosystem alone doesn't sustain a movement for 50 years.
Right. It doesn't. The most critical factor is the subterranean infrastructure we discussed earlier.
The fiber optic cables.
Yes. After Compton's or the Black Cat, the local communities in California were intensely energized. But the national organizational infrastructure required to sustain that specific energy and broadcast it outward didn't quite exist in a cohesive way yet.
But by 1969, it did.
Yes. By 1969 in New York, the groundwork laid by the homophile movement had matured. The activists were experienced. When the Stonewall riots broke out, that infrastructure was finally prepared to capture the raw, local anger and channel it systematically.
So they already had the mailing lists, the organizers, and the understanding of how to run a campaign. They just needed the right fuel to pour into the engine.
And they seized the moment immediately. Within weeks of the riots, activists in New York formed the Gay Liberation Front.
Notice the shift in language there. From the polite homophile society to a liberation front.
Exactly. They entirely abandoned the respectability politics of the Mattachine era. They embraced a radical confrontational politics that demanded total systemic overhaul rather than mere assimilation.
They also revolutionized their communication strategies. They stopped relying on mainstream media, which continued to publish mocking, derogatory articles about the riots.
They started publishing their own independent media, like Come Out magazine.
They literally seized the means of production for their own narrative. If the New York Times wouldn't cover them fairly, they would build their own printing presses and distribute the news themselves.
And perhaps their most brilliant tactical maneuver was how they institutionalized the memory of the event itself.
This is key.
As the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising approached in June 1970, organizers like Craig Rodwell and Brenda Howard orchestrated the Christopher Street Liberation Day March.
And they coordinated simultaneous marches in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, right?
Yes, she did.
So they didn't just let the anniversary pass as a historical footnote. They engineered an annual physical occupation of public space to ensure the memories stayed alive.
The evolution of those initial protest marches into the highly organized annual Pride events we see globally today was a strategic masterstroke.
It ensured that Stonewall wasn't remembered as just a localized, chaotic riot, but as an enduring, replicable blueprint for political mobilization.
Stonewall stuck in the cultural memory because the activists actively engineered it to stick.
That makes total sense. Now, before we move forward into the 1970s, I want to pivot and look much closer at who exactly was throwing that coffee at Compton's, and who was physically fighting the tactical police on the front lines at Stonewall.
That is deeply important.
Because when we examine this history, it is intellectually dishonest to treat the LGBTQ acronym as a monolith. We have to center the margins, particularly the transgender, intersex, and two-spirit histories that the archival sources highlight with immense clarity.
The broader movement has undeniably relied on the radical, unavoidable visibility of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals.
Because they couldn't just blend in.
Right. These were people whose identities could not be hidden behind a conservative business suit at a polite Philadelphia picket line. Their existence was a constant, unavoidable confrontation with societal norms.
If we look at the historical figures, you see this dynamic early on. In the early 1950s, you have Christine Jorgensen.
Yes.
She was an American who traveled to Denmark for gender-affirming surgery and returned to the United States to find herself at the center of an absolute international media circus.
Her visibility forced the American public to confront the medical and social reality of transgender existence in a way they never had before.
And moving forward into the liberation era of the late 60s and 70s, the archives center figures like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera.
They were central, vital figures in the Stonewall era and the subsequent grassroots organizing in New York.
They co-founded STAR, right? The Straight Transvestite Action Revolutionaries?
Yes, which provided housing and support for homeless queer youth and sex workers. But what is critical to understand is that Johnson and Rivera were not just fighting against societal norms and police brutality.
They were frequently fighting against aggressive marginalization from within the gay liberation movement itself.
Exactly.
Let's use an analogy here. I like to think of it not as a single unified entity, but as a convoy of distinct vehicles traveling down the same highway.
Okay, a convoy.
Yeah. You have all these different identities traveling together for safety and political leverage. It gives the community the sheer numbers required to force a public debate.
Right, there is power in numbers.
But they're driving entirely different vehicles that require different maintenance and fuel. And as the movement seeks mainstream political power, the leaders of the convoy, often the most privileged members, are inevitably tempted to leave the slower or more controversial vehicles behind just to get to the destination faster.
And historically, those controversial vehicles were transgender and gender nonconforming peoples. The convoy analogy perfectly illustrates the tension. As the mainstream gay and lesbian movement sought political respectability and legislative wins in the 1970s and beyond, we frequently saw leadership actively exclude trans people.
Which is heartbreaking.
The argument, grounded in brutal political pragmatism, was that including gender identity protections in civil rights bills would make it impossible to pass basic sexual orientation protections.
They literally asked transgender people to wait their turn.
Yes, and that tension isn't just historical. It is a profound recurring theme. The legacy of that internal struggle deeply informs modern transgender rights advocacy.
Today, organizations are fighting incredibly complex, specialized battles across multiple legislative fronts. We see this documented by modern resources like the Trans Legislation Tracker.
Right, the landscape is incredibly dense right now.
We are looking at ongoing, state-by-state legal conflicts regarding the fundamental ability to update identity documents, access to medically necessary gender-affirming healthcare, and intense debates over protections concerning school environments, bathroom access, and sports participation.
Because the acronym encompasses vastly different specific needs. The source material also brings up intersex advocacy, specifically highlighting the work of groups like the Intersex Justice Project.
Their fight is fundamentally different from a fight for, say, marriage equality.
Completely different. It is a highly specific battle for bodily autonomy.
For a listener who might not know the specific mechanics of this, what exactly is the Intersex Justice Project challenging?
They are primarily challenging the medical establishment's historic treatment of intersex traits. Intersex individuals are born with sex characteristics, such as chromosomes, gonads, or genitals, that do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies.
Right.
Historically, and continuing today, doctors often perform surgeries on intersex infants and children to make their bodies conform to binary norms.
Before the child can even consent.
Exactly. The Intersex Justice Project argues that these surgeries are medically unnecessary, frequently cause long-term physical and psychological trauma, and violate the individual's fundamental right to consent to irreversible alterations to their own body.
It is a profound fight for medical ethics and bodily sovereignty.
It is. Furthermore, the archives push us to recognize that many of the legal and social frameworks we use to discuss gender and sexuality are distinctly Western concepts.
Yes, if we look at the history of two-spirit identity, it fundamentally reframes the whole conversation.
It really does. The term two-spirit highlights indigenous understandings of gender and sexuality.
Many Native American and First Nations cultures historically recognized, integrated, and often revered individuals who embodied both masculine and feminine spirits, granting them specific honored roles within their communities.
But those indigenous traditions were severely disrupted and systematically dismantled by colonial frameworks.
Particularly the federal boarding school systems.
Yes. Those schools, which forcefully separated Native children from their families to assimilate them into Western culture, actively sought to erase those complex gender roles. They enforced strict Western binary gender presentations and violently punished any deviation.
So when you analyze all of this together, the specific healthcare and document battles of trans folks, the bodily autonomy and medical consent fights of intersex people, the decolonial struggles of two-spirit communities alongside the marriage and employment fights of gay and lesbian people, it becomes clear how diverse this movement really is.
It's a vast spectrum of needs.
They are sharing a destination of equal rights and human dignity, but the specific legal mechanics, the societal hurdles, and the historical traumas they are navigating are vastly different.
The synergy of the movement comes from the collective power of moving in the same direction, sharing organizing resources, and providing mutual defense against broad legislative attacks.
But the tension arises when political realities force a prioritization of whose rights get secured first.
Right. The broader movement owes a profound historical debt to the gender nonconforming people who led the early street activism. Yet it has persistently struggled to center their unique legal and medical needs when negotiating with mainstream political power structures.
Right. And the political momentum that the broader movement managed to build throughout the 1970s, you think of significant milestones like the election of Harvey Milk to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977.
Right, that was a huge moment of progress.
But it was suddenly forced to a complete agonize and halt. Because just as the community started securing a literal seat at the political table, a brand new crisis emerged that threatened to wipe out the community entirely.
The 1980s.
Yes, the 1980s brought a public health emergency that forced the movement to abandon polite political lobbying for sheer survival.
We must explore the AIDS epidemic, which represents one of the most devastating chapters in modern public health history.
It really is.
It is impossible to overstate the trauma this brought to the LGBTQ community. The early days of the epidemic, stretching from the early to mid-1980s, were defined by three intersecting failures: profound medical uncertainty, deeply entrenched public stigma, and a truly devastating level of active government neglect.
The archival records from this era paint a grim, terrifying picture. You have a new, fatal, heavily stigmatized virus targeting a population that mainstream society already actively despised.
And the political establishment, from the White House down to local mayors, largely ignored it.
Mainstream media outlets frequently mocked it or framed it as a moral failing.
And the medical establishment and federal health agencies were tragically slow to mobilize funding, research, or public health messaging. People were dying by the thousands in horrific pain, and the government was practically silent.
This systemic failure catalyzed the birth of a radically different kind of activism. In 1987, seeing that traditional lobbying and polite pleas for help were failing to save lives, activists in New York formed ACTUP, the AIDS Coalition, to unleash power.
Their core realization was that silence from the government equated to a death sentence for their community. So they pivoted to highly confrontational, disruptive, direct action.
Wait, hold on. I'm trying to square this evolution. You have a group of people who, a decade prior, were fighting for the basic right to exist in a bar or keep a desk job.
Right.
How do people who are artists, teachers, bartenders, and office workers suddenly morph into a grassroots public health agency capable of challenging federal medical policy? That jump requires a huge leap in expertise.
It was a leap made out of sheer desperate necessity. The mechanism of ACTUP's success was their rigorous commitment to self-education.
They taught themselves.
They did. They didn't just march with angry signs. They formed specialized working groups. Members literally went to medical libraries, learned virology, and painstakingly figured out exactly how the Food and Drug Administration's multi-phase drug trial system worked.
Wow.
They identified the exact bureaucratic bottlenecks that were keeping experimental treatments out of the hands of dying patients.
So they mapped the machinery of the enemy?
Exactly. They mapped the machinery. And once they understood how the FDA worked better than some lawmakers did, they deployed targeted disruption.
Like what?
Well, in October of 1988, ACTUP shut down the FDA headquarters in Maryland. They didn't just block the doors. They brought highly produced fact sheets, they wore lab coats, and they expertly manipulated the media.
I've seen the photos from that.
They timed their protests to ensure maximum visibility on the evening news broadcasts, forcing news anchors to explain FDA trial delays to millions of Americans sitting in their living rooms.
They demanded concepts like parallel tracking, right? Allowing patients who didn't qualify for clinical trials to still access experimental drugs.
Yes, that was one of their major victories.
They practically forced their way into the rooms where scientific policy decisions were being made, and they used aggressive, brilliant graphic design to control their messaging.
Oh, the art was vital.
The iconic Silence Equals Death poster campaign, featuring the pink triangle reclaimed from the Holocaust on a stark black background. I mean, it remains a masterclass in political communication.
And alongside the intense anger and direct action, there was profound, unquantifiable grief, which was also weaponized politically. The creation of the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt represents this dual function perfectly.
The logistics of the quilt are astounding. People hand-sewed 3-by-6-foot fabric panels the size of a human grave to memorialize individuals who had died of AIDS.
When it was first displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in 1987, it covered a space larger than a football field.
It served as a vital site of communal mourning for a community barred from many traditional grieving spaces. But it also functioned as a massive, unavoidable visual indictment of the government's failure to protect its citizens.
You could not look at the acreage of that quilt and deny the scale of the epidemic.
The crucible of the AIDS crisis forever changed the relationship between the LGBTQ community and the state. Before AIDS, the medical community was largely seen as an adversary, the institutions that historically classified homosexuality as a mental illness to be cured.
But through the relentless activism of ACTUP, the community forced the medical establishment to view them as informed partners in combating a public health emergency.
That era forged a highly sophisticated, battle-tested generation of activists. They learned how to organize on a national scale, how to handle the press, how to manipulate federal bureaucracies, and how to build massive fundraising networks.
And as the legal archives show, those sophisticated advocacy strategies and organizational structures eventually translated into highly organized, multi-decade legal campaigns within the federal court system.
The street activists of the 80s realized they needed a permanent legal shield. The activism moved from shutting down the FDA directly into the courtrooms.
A completely new battlefield.
The legal trajectory of LGBTQ rights over the last 40 years is a fascinating study in incremental constitutional strategy. Let's trace that path, because it certainly wasn't a straight line of continuous victories. In fact, one of the biggest initial battles ended in a severe, devastating setback.
Yes, we must look at the 1986 Supreme Court case, Bowers v. Hardwick. Michael Hardwick was arrested in his own bedroom in Georgia for violating the state's sodomy law. The case made it to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the court actually upheld state sodomy laws, legally validating the criminalization of private, consensual gay intimacy.
And the wording of that decision was brutal.
The majority opinion was notably hostile. It explicitly cited historical and religious condemnation of homosexuality as a valid basis for the law.
That 1986 decision was a crushing blow. It essentially told the community that the Constitution did not protect the most intimate relationships. But organizations like Lambda Legal and the ACLU didn't dissolve.
No, they dug in.
They spent the next 17 years meticulously building a new legal framework, case by case, state by state, and in 2003, their strategy culminated in Lawrence v. Texas.
Lawrence v. Texas represents a monumental reversal. The Supreme Court explicitly overruled the Bowers decision. They struck down sodomy laws nationwide.
I want to break down the specific constitutional argument here for the listener. What was the exact legal lever the Supreme Court pulled in Lawrence?
The primary lever was the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Okay, so for a listener who isn't a constitutional scholar, what does that mean in practice?
The Due Process Clause essentially dictates that the government cannot deprive you of your life, liberty, or property without a valid, compelling legal reason. In Lawrence, the court ruled that what consenting adults do in the privacy of their own homes falls under a fundamental liberty interest.
The state simply has no valid, compelling reason to police private intimacy.
Exactly. The court decided the state had no place in the bedroom.
It's like setting up a very deliberate game of constitutional dominoes. First, you establish a baseline right to privacy. The government must stay out of the bedroom. And once that first domino falls, you have the momentum to push for the next one. Equal protection under the law.
Right, because if the highest court in land establishes that you are not a presumptive criminal and that your private life is constitutionally protected, the legal logic holding up other discriminatory laws begins to buckle under its own weight.
If we are not criminals, you cannot arbitrarily discriminate against us in the public sphere.
Which leads directly to the fight for civil institutions, most notably marriage equality.
Let's look at how rapidly those dominoes fell. In 1996, the federal government passed the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, essentially defining marriage strictly as between a man and a woman for federal purposes.
But state by state, activists chipped away at it. You have the Goodridge decision in Massachusetts in 2003, making it the first state to legalize same-sex marriage based on their state constitution.
Then the federal dominoes accelerate. In 2013, the Supreme Court decides United States v. Windsor, which strikes down key sections of DOMA, ruling that the federal government must recognize same-sex marriages performed in states where they are legal.
And finally, in 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges establishes nationwide marriage equality, utilizing both the due process and equal protection clauses.
But the legal battleground wasn't solely focused on the institution of marriage. It was deeply concerned with basic economic survival and physical safety. We see this culminate in 2020 with Bostock v. Clayton County.
Bostock is a fascinating textualist ruling. The Supreme Court ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which explicitly prohibits employment discrimination based on sex, inherently protects workers from being fired simply for being gay or transgender.
Because it's logically tied together.
The logic was that it is impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without factoring in that individual's sex.
We also see the dismantling of institutional barriers in the military with the legislative repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010, allowing gay, lesbian, and bisexual people to serve openly.
And the establishment of federal protections against violence with the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2009.
But what I find crucial to understand about all of these courtroom victories is the underlying evidentiary strategy. Legal advocates utilize profound constitutional theory, sure, but they also relied heavily on hard demographic data.
Yes, the data was essential.
The archives specifically mention research institutions like the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law.
The Williams Institute fundamentally altered how these cases were argued. They provided the courts with rigorous, peer-reviewed statistical data showing the real-world, tangible impact of discrimination.
They showed the courts that they weren't just ruling on abstract constitutional theories.
Exactly. They were deciding the economic stability, health outcomes, and family security of millions of Americans. When arguing for marriage equality, advocates could point to data showing exactly how many children were being raised in same-sex households and how the denial of marriage rights actively harms those children.
It gave the constitutional arguments necessary empirical weight.
It did. But the legal system is an active, ongoing dialogue, and the courts are currently navigating intense, complex tensions. The source material instructs us to look at recent cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop and 303 Creative.
Right, and we want to report impartially on the mechanics of these decisions. These cases essentially represent the legal friction between established state-level non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people and the First Amendment claims of religious liberty and free speech.
Claims asserted by business owners who declined to provide custom services for same-sex weddings.
It is a profound constitutional balancing act. The courts are actively wrestling with a complex question. How do you reconcile a state's compelling interest in ensuring equal access to public accommodations with an individual's constitutional right to religious exercise or their right against compelled speech?
These cases demonstrate that the legal landscape is not entirely settled. As non-discrimination protections expand, they inevitably intersect with other deeply held constitutional rights, forcing the judiciary to constantly recalibrate the boundaries.
And while the Supreme Court is settling these major institutional questions regarding employment and marriage for adults, a parallel, equally vital battleground has emerged for the next generation.
The youth.
Right. Courtroom victories protect adults in the workplace, but what about a 14-year-old walking down a school hallway? The schools and the libraries are where the fight for the future is currently centered.
The focus on education and youth advocacy is central to the history of LGBTQ civil rights because vulnerability is heavily concentrated in youth populations.
Organizations like GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, and the Trevor Project have heavily documented the disproportionate risks that LGBTQ youth face compared to their peers.
We are talking about significantly higher rates of youth homelessness, frequently stemming directly from family rejection after coming out.
And we are looking at severe targeted bullying in educational settings and the corresponding deeply concerning mental health struggles and suicide rates. The advocacy in this space is intense and highly localized.
It involves complex legal and political debates over how Title IX regulations protect transgender students in locker rooms and sports. It involves the implementation of robust anti-bullying policies at the school board level.
And crucially, it involves the fight for inclusive curricula, ensuring that students can actually see themselves, their families, and their history reflected in the textbooks and literature they read.
Which brings us to the archives and the physical libraries themselves. Organizations like the American Library Association, the Lesbian History Archives, and One Archives in Los Angeles are doing monumental work in this space.
I find it deeply ironic that libraries, which are historically viewed in popular culture as places of quiet, unassuming conformity, where you get shushed for talking too loudly,
Right.
They have actually become some of the most vocal, heavily contested battlegrounds for civil rights and visibility.
The irony is rich, but the underlying logic is perfectly sound. We must contextualize why educational policy and public history are central to maintaining civil rights.
Why is that?
Because a group's legal standing is fundamentally precarious if their history is not preserved in the archives or taught in schools. If society is allowed to forget that a community exists, or forgets the specific mechanisms of discrimination they have faced, it becomes remarkably easy for political forces to roll back their legal protection.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Archives are not just dusty storage rooms filled with old newsletters. They are active arsenals of historical evidence, proving a community's enduring presence and humanity.
They prove the community has always been a fundamental part of the civic fabric, not just a recent invention. And speaking of that broader fabric, having so thoroughly explored the domestic legal landscape here in the United States, we really need to broaden the lens.
Yes, looking globally is essential.
Because the rights secured in one specific nation sharply highlight the ongoing, frequently life-or-death struggles happening globally.
The history of LGBTQ rights is inherently a global human rights struggle, and the legal realities vary wildly across borders.
Yeah.
The source material highlights international frameworks that have been established to address this.
Like the UN initiatives.
Yes, you have the UN Free and Equal campaign, which works to promote equal rights and fair treatment globally through public education and political pressure. You have the Yogyakarta Principles, drafted in 2006 by international human rights experts, which meticulously applied existing international human rights laws specifically to issues of sexual orientation and gender identity.
And organizations like ILGA World rigorously track global legislation, providing an annual map of where rights are expanding and where they are contracting.
And what that ILGA map reveals is a set of stark, terrifying global disparities.
On one hand, you have nations in Europe and the Americas that are rapidly expanding legal gender recognition, securing adoption and family rights, and banning conversion therapy.
On the other hand, you have dozens of nations where state-sponsored homophobia is the explicit law of the land, where same-sex intimacy is actively criminalized and in several countries punishable by the death penalty.
This severe disparity creates an ongoing global refugee crisis. Organizations like Immigration Equality focus entirely on the immense complexities of asylum claims based on sexual orientation and gender identity.
People are literally fleeing their homes, crossing borders, and navigating complex immigration courts simply because their existence is considered illegal and punishable by death in their home countries.
I want to ask a grounded question about this global effort, though. We talk about the UN and international human rights frameworks, but with such vastly different cultural baselines and such different legal realities from country to country, how does a high-level international framework like a United Nations declaration actually influence local laws on the ground?
It's difficult.
Like, does a UN statement actually stop a local police raid in a hostile country?
It is the central defining tension of global activism. International frameworks do not have direct legislative power to overturn a local law, but they provide two vital mechanisms: a standardized legal vocabulary and organized political pressure.
How does that help activists on the ground?
When the UN formally declares that violence based on sexual orientation is a fundamental human rights violation, it gives local grassroots activists a powerful, globally recognized standard to leverage against their own governments. It provides crucial visibility, legitimacy, and often opens channels for international funding and diplomatic support.
But there is a dangerous flip side to that international visibility, isn't there?
There is a severe risk. That visibility can easily trigger severe political backlash. We frequently see authoritarian regimes frame LGBTQ rights not as human rights, but as a Western import or a dangerous form of cultural imperialism designed to undermine traditional values.
So they use it as propaganda.
Exactly. Leaders use anti-LGBTQ policies as a populist tool for political control, rallying their conservative base by scapegoating a highly vulnerable minority. So the international community has to navigate a very delicate high-stakes balance, providing robust, meaningful support for local activists without inadvertently painting a larger target on their backs and validating the propaganda of authoritarian governments.
It requires an extraordinary level of geopolitical nuance and constant communication with the activists actually on the ground. So, as we pull back from the global stage and look at the entire complex journey we have mapped out today, the scope of this history is truly vast.
It covers so much ground.
We started in the paranoid, secretive atmosphere of the Cold War, exploring the covert, mimeographed newsletters of the early homophile movement, trying to survive the Lavender Scare.
We moved through the evolution of direct action, analyzing the literal street battles and the flying coffee cups at Compton's Cafeteria, and the sustained six-day uprising at Stonewall, which activists strategically transformed from local anger into a sustained, organized liberation movement.
We navigated the agonizing crucible of the AIDS epidemic, examining how a community fought for its very survival against government apathy by mastering FDA policy and weaponizing their grief. We traced the meticulous, decades-long legal strategy that toppled constitutional dominoes from the failure of Bowers to the triumph of Obergefell.
And we analyze the ongoing vital fights in our schools, our library archives, and out onto the complex, uneven global stage.
It is a profound testament to the adaptability and resilience of a community that was forced to utilize every available mechanism: lawsuits, street marches, graphic art, historical archives, mutual aid networks, and highly coordinated political lobbying to demand visibility, fundamental dignity, and legal equality.
It's an ongoing evolution.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought directly inspired by the Smithsonian's historical records.
Oh, about the archives.
Yes, their curators note that for decades, early historians and archivists used coded labels to describe LGBTQ people. They would catalog an individual as a confirmed bachelor or a spinster, or describe two women living together for 40 years as close companions.
To deliberately sanitize and erase their queer lives from the official historical record.
Exactly. It makes you realize how easily history can be obscured, altered, or completely erased by the people holding the pen.
It highlights the immense power of language and classification in shaping public memory and historical truth.
So I want to challenge you to look closely at the present day. Look at the complex, intersecting identities, the diverse community structures, and the highly specific modern activist tactics we see right now in the news.
And wonder how it will be recorded.
What aspects of today's reality might future historians mislabel, misunderstand, or inadvertently erase a century from now? What are the confirmed bachelors of our current era?
A profound question that reminds us that the fight over who gets to write the future's history is happening right now.
History is never just a list of dates, and resistance never just appears out of nowhere. It is built over decades, in the dark, through quiet organizing and loud defiance, long before it ever makes the front page. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.